Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Thank you everyone for joining. We're going to have people trickle in. We've had about 100 and some people register for this town hall meeting, and it's super exciting. We're going to go for about an hour and a half. My name is Taylor Bachrach. I'm the proud member of Parliament for Skeena-Bulkley Valley up in Northwest BC. And I also serve as the NDP's transport critic. And it's a real delight to welcome you all to our town hall on passenger rail transport in Canada, passenger rail for all. And tonight we're going to talk about a number of things. I think most folks have joined because they're jazzed about the idea of Canada having a proper, effective, and sustainable passenger rail system for moving people around in this country. And I think most of you are probably aware that, unfortunately, our country lags behind much of the world, that in many ways, we haven't kept up when it comes to passenger trains. And so we're going to talk tonight about what some realistic and practical changes that the federal government can make that would move us ahead and ensure that people right across the country have access to passenger rail. Right now, I'm on the train, believe it or not. I'm taking the train from Toronto to my home in Smithers as a way of experiencing firsthand the state of affairs. We just pulled in to the station in Winnipeg, which is good timing because I have 2 bars of 5G on my cell phone, and hopefully it's going to be enough for the purposes of this call. So riding the Canadian, which is a classic Canadian train, and I think the second longest passenger route in the world after the Siberian Railroad. I see Terry nodding, so I think I got that factoid right. So just to bring a little bit of focus to this before I introduce our special guests and go over some of the ground rules in terms of how this is going to work. I hope tonight we have a chance to talk about a number of things. We're going to talk a little bit about the federal government's current plan for high frequency rail between Toronto and Quebec City. We're going to talk about how that affects the rest of Via Rail service, or could affect the rest of Via Rail service across Canada. We're going to talk about privatization and the risks that privatization poses. I hope we talk a little bit about the need for a legislative mandate for Via Rail. We're going to talk about fleet replacement, what it's going to take to replace and renew these 70-plus-year-old trains like the one that I'm on right now, which is a beautiful train, but apparently reaching the end of its serviceable life. And I hope we're also going to talk about my private member's bill, C-371, which I tabled on Thursday, which would give passenger trains priority on shared tracks in Canada. I think anyone who's taken the train understands that one of the big challenges is the fact that passenger trains share the tracks with freight trains and kind of play poor cousin to freight traffic. And that results in having to pull off on sidings more frequently than should be the case. Makes it very difficult for VIA to maintain a predictable schedule. And of course, that makes it hard for people to use the train as transportation if you can't get where you need to go within a reasonable amount of time. So those are a few of the topics we're hoping to cover. In terms of how this show is going to roll from here until 90 minutes from now, we have 3 really special guests. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. They're going to talk for about 5 minutes on different topics. And then after that, people who are on the call can put up your hand and ask a question or make a comment. And then we'll go to our guests and see if they have a reaction to that or an answer to your question. It's really important if you can keep your interventions as short as possible and as concise as possible, then we can fit in as many questions as we can in the time that we have together this evening. If you could start by introducing yourself and where you're from, that would be really fun, so we can hear where people are joining from across Canada. And then we'll just go as long as we can. And I think any question related to passenger rail in Canada is fair game. So you don't have to stick to the topics that we've mentioned there. But it's my pleasure to introduce, actually, before I introduce our special guests, I want to give a shout out to my team, Margaret Crew and Ben Tassell in Ottawa, who are helping with all the logistics and making this call possible, bringing us together, and staying up late to do that. If for some reason my cell signal goes down, or the train starts moving, or the Via Rail crew comes in and tells me that I'm not allowed to have a town hall meeting on the train, they are going to take over the reins and facilitate the rest of the meeting. But now that we're in Winnipeg, we should be okay on that front. I think that's it for logistics. I'm going to introduce our special guest. So starting with Terry Johnson is the president of Transport Action Canada. I was going to call him Terrence. I know he goes by both. And Terry is a transportation expert. He has a master's degree in politics and economics from Oxford University. He's been a transport advocate here in Canada for over a decade. I've had the pleasure of seeing him at the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Transport in Ottawa on several occasions. And currently he works with Transport Action Canada, which is one of Canada's leading voices advocating for passengers and for effective passenger transportation from coast to coast. So we'll go to Terry in a moment. After Terry, we're going to hear from Nate Wallace. After Terry, we're going to hear from Christopher Graper, and Christopher is with Unifor. Unifor is the union that represents the onboard crews on the Via Rail trains. I had the pleasure of riding from Toronto to, where did we ride to? Sudbury yesterday with Christopher. He got on the train with me and we had an excellent conversation. You can catch that conversation. We made a little video together and I'll be posting it to my social media channels. But right now, Christopher is the national campaign organizer for a campaign called Get Canada Back on Track, which is a Unifor campaign directed at improving passenger rail service in this country. So a really great fit with tonight's discussion. And then last but not least, Nate Wallace is a public transit advocate with Environmental Defense. And he is currently the coordinator of Environmental Defense's Clean Transportation Program. I hope I got that right, Nate. And prior to working with Environmental Defense, Nate worked with the Canadian Urban Transit Association and was in charge of advocacy during a really tough time for urban transit authorities during the pandemic, when they saw ridership plummet and some really difficult financial contexts that they had to work through. And so I'm hoping that Nate can talk a little bit about the environmental dimension of all this, because we know passenger rail is a sustainable form of transportation and could be a really central plank in Canada's effort to combat climate change. And so he'll bring that perspective to our conversation this evening. Okay, so without further ado, let's go to Terry Johnson from Transport Action Canada. Take it away, Terry.
Good evening, Taylor, and thank you so much for organising this town hall, and thank you for taking the Canadian to experience it firsthand yourself. I got a feeling that it might be running on time because they know there's an MP on board. You're getting quite lucky this evening. One person who was hoping to join us is our Atlantic Region President, Tim Heyman. Unfortunately, his train actually ended up being cancelled halfway across the Maritimes due to locomotive failure and a bunch of earlier problems that afflicted that train. So I don't know if Tim's been able to make the call, because he's probably on a bus somewhere between New Brunswick and Quebec right about now. But that kind of shows you the situation we're in as a country because of many years of a lack of investment in transportation. Transport Action Canada as an organization was originally Transport 2000 Canada. We were formed in 1978, roughly the same time as Via Rail was created from CN and CP's passenger operations. And we are advocates for sustainable public transportation and for the rights of passengers. So we want it really to be possible to get from anywhere in Canada to anywhere else in Canada with the minimum amount of hassle by any mode possible, but in terms of the sheer efficiency, both in terms of physics, the number of people who can be supported, and the ease with which that mode of transportation can be decarbonized, rail really needs to be the backbone of our national network. And the Canadian ought to be much more than it currently is today, especially just 2 trains a week across the country really is not enough. And if you were in Winnipeg and you wanted to get a bus anywhere westbound, well, there's just one a week to Regina. And that's a bus that runs overnight. So you're up all night on the bus as well. So we are in dire straits as a country in terms of our ground connectivity, the glue that holds us together. And we have been campaigning for many years now for reinvestment in Via Rail. We are very pleased that the federal government heeded the warnings that were being given about the state of the fleet in the Quebec-Windsor corridor and made an investment, and those trains are arriving, the new trains in the Quebec-Windsor corridor are really arriving just in the nick of time. We're at the point where the equipment there that's 40 years old, and some of it that's 7 years old, is at the end of its life. It is time to say, no, it doesn't, we can spend more and more money maintaining this, but it does not make sense to do so, and there may be a limit to what maintenance can achieve beyond a certain age. And that investment is just coming to fruition in the corridor. Talk a little bit more about what's going on in the corridor in a minute. But for long distance and our remote services that serve a lot of northern and indigenous communities, those are nearly all cars that were built in 1955 for Canadian Pacific after the Second World War. They are brilliant quality. The original build quality is amazing. As you can see, it's still running fine today. We did have the whole incident in the last couple of years with some fatigue being detected and therefore testing having to be done. Some cars were even sacrificed in crash tests to make sure that the trains were safe for continued operation. But we know that to build new trains, more than 250 cars worth of new equipment for Canada to the same quality, and to run a fair and open procurement process, and to do the design to make that train what it needs to be for Canada and then deliver it, could take up to 10 years. So the window is rapidly closing on actually being our government getting the act together and placing that order for that new equipment to ensure that cities in Western Canada and Eastern Canada, that anywhere outside the corridor still has train service in the early 2030s. So that's really where our focus as an organization is now on rail, is to make sure that there is a future for long distance remote service rail in Canada. Back in the corridor, we have been supporters of high frequency rail and of speeding up and increasing service, both on the existing lines and looking at reopening older lines to or the abandoned line between Peterborough and Smith Falls to give a dedicated track in the corridor where its frequency of trains does justify that kind of investment. But we are a little bit shocked now that in the last year, the government decided, in the last year or so, the government decided that what had been a Via Rail project has suddenly become an effort to in fact outsource that whole operation to a private partner. And I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of questions about this later, but we do not believe that the government has provided a justification for why bringing in a private sector operator to take over the existing corridor, including that new fleet of trains the taxpayer just paid for, is going to create a better service for passengers or value for money for Canadians. So we believe that high frequency rail should indeed happen. But we do question the procurement model that's being currently used. I'm going to leave it there, so we've got plenty of time for questions. Thank you, Taylor.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Terry. I'm sure there's lots of questions that are going to surround the whole HFR and privatization conversation, and we'll have time to dig into that. Next, we're going to go to Christopher Graper from Unifor.
Hi there, everybody. Hi, Taylor. Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you again. You look comfortable there in your roomette for your cabin for two on the Canadian.
Yeah, things are really great, and we can hear you loud and clear, Chris. And thanks for joining me yesterday on the train. We had a great chat for those 8 hours we were together up to Sudbury. And I thought, Chris, you could talk a little bit about Unifor's Get Canada Back on Track campaign, and why this is important to the folks who work on the train, what some of the goals of that campaign are, and share that with folks on the call today.
Absolutely, for sure. I'm happy to talk about that, and thank you, Taylor and Terry as well. Our campaign is primarily concerned with the privatization of Via Rail, as Terry was just mentioning. We're expecting to see privatization perhaps as early as January of 2025, which is extremely worrying. The current transport minister's plan, as Terry was mentioning earlier, is to hand over the existing operation, Via's existing operation. We don't know if that means just the corridor or the long distance in the essential services as well. But the plan is to hand that over to a private operator as early as January of 2025. And on the condition that this consortium of companies builds the new HFR line as well. Now, right now, we don't see any kind of a plan other than HFR. And one of our major questions is, if HFR isn't coming online for 20 some odd years, what's the plan in the interim to make sure that Canadians can get around from one place to the other? It's incredibly difficult to get anywhere right now by public transport in Canada right now, especially at Christmas time. There's a lot of people that would like to go home for the holidays and do so without leaving a carbon footprint. And one of the things we've been discussing recently is that is more difficult to do now than ever before. Taking the case of Via Rail, we have less capacity. We have fewer cars and engines to add trains and add frequencies. And so ultimately what it means is there are fewer green options to get you home for the holidays than ever before. And for those who are looking for those green options to get home, it's extremely worrying. And so our group is concerned with this, and we're concerned, of course, with our jobs as well. We want rail transport to expand in Canada, and that's why we're building connections with groups such as Transport Action Canada and with yourself to try and fight against this very concerning plan. Our group has 4 particular goals in mind. We'd like to see the signing of a Via Rail Act. That particularly would provide for track priority, which is extremely important, and as your bill is a very important step towards that as well. But additionally, Via Rail lacks any kind of a mandate to provide service to Canadians, to improve rail service. It doesn't have any kind of a mandate, and it never has. It's also never had any kind of a stable budget to do that. And I think these are key factors that are implicit in the Via Rail Act that are important for us to try and achieve at the federal level. We also are, of course, in favor of keeping Via Rail public. We'd like to see service expansion right across the country, coast to coast. A lot of people are not aware that even in the corridor, where we do have a reasonably good service or a relatively good service, we are still down by over 15% from pre-pandemic 2019 service levels. So this is not just an issue in one region, it's right across the country. We face the same issues of decades and decades of underfunding by the federal government into Via Rail. And that's why we're seeing the issues we have now. And lastly, one of the goals of our campaign, we are eager to work toward passenger and worker governance on the board of directors for Via Rail. Again, Via's board has traditionally lacked that type of input. And I think that in a larger sense, Via really does lack input into governance from the passengers and from the workers. And I think this is a standard feature of many corporations, many railways across the world, and it should be of ours as well. So those are the main points we're trying to work toward, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to make connections with other organizations and to take questions. I've added the website for the campaign in the chat, and I urge everybody to go to the link and please do send me a message with any questions. And I'm looking forward to everybody's questions today.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris. Those are really great points. And the point about having passengers and workers on the board of Via Rail would really, help the organization make decisions that are not only in the best interest of passengers and in the best financial interest of the corporation, but also have an eye to the experience of people who ride the train. And that's I think right. That's something that would really strengthen things. So last but not least, we'll go to Nate Wallace from Environmental Defense. Nate.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to today's town hall. I'm here because, we believe that Canada really has a kind of a gaping hole in our plan to, reduce carbon emissions. I'm in Toronto. You're catching me in my hotel room. I took the via rail train from Ottawa to get here. And I'm here because tomorrow I'll be at the government announcement to essentially require Canada to shift to 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035. And that's, in our view, that's great. We're talking about, a 430 million ton reduction in GHG emissions. And that, equivalent to 73,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of gas that's not going to be burned as a result of this policy. That's fantastic. But at the same time, Canada, while we have targets to be increasing sales of zero emission vehicles, we have no targets to reduce vehicle kilometers traveled, which is a real clear way that we can be reducing transport emissions right now in the near term. Because, for example, zero emission vehicles, they take a very long time to, once a new car is sold, it lasts on the road for 15 years. So the bulk of the emissions reductions from that policy are going to happen between 2030 and 2050, not immediately. BC has a vehicle kilometers reduction traveled targets in their climate plan. Other jurisdictions across the world do. It's something that we need to be adopting at the national level. And when we do that, I think that will bring attention to the fact that Canada really hasn't been investing in passenger rail or via rail at all, really. We still haven't recovered from the cuts that's been levied on the system in the 80s and 90s. Via rail certainly needs its own legislation and mandate with dedicated capital and operating subsidies that is resilient to forces like the pandemic and things like I think we should be, with that in place, we could have that, I think, advocate better for themselves. Because right now I feel like they really aren't in the same way that, for example, Amtrak has, where they advocated, they put out a service expansion plan, and that got funded in the bipartisan infrastructure law. $66 billion going to Amtrak for service expansion that Canada is really falling behind on. So, and there's been a real dichotomy between urban transit investment and passenger rail investment. Since 2016, we've had $23.5 billion go into urban transit systems, mainly just as capital funding, mind you, not operating funding. There still is that significant dichotomy there. But at the same time, we haven't seen that same level of ambition being given to passenger rail. And that's something that we really need to be seeing to reduce carbon emissions, because we in urban transit, which is my background, we often talk about car dependency, people being forced to drive because there's no real other options. And in Canada, when it comes to traveling between cities, people are really forced to fly in a lot of cases, which really isn't right, because air travel is the fastest growing source of carbon emissions in Canada. It's gone up by 75% since 2005. We're talking about 22 million tons of carbon, which is a lot of carbon. So we certainly need to be moving in the direction of investing in passenger rail and looking at high-speed rail options as well. I want to address, the myth and the idea that Canada can't have high-speed rail because we lack the density. The Toronto to Quebec City corridor is already denser than existing high-speed rail lines in terms of population and city pairs than others country like other lines in other countries like Sweden, Germany, and Spain. So we need to be moving in that direction, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Nate. Some really great points raised there. And I was watching the chat, and There are some excellent comments, I think, based on things you were saying. I'll just read a couple of them. Roger says, the future of cars is electric, but the future of transport is not cars. And that came from someone on Twitter that he recounted for us. And I think that's an excellent point. Like, many of us are going to still need automobiles, but for so much of the population, other options are going to be better suited. And where I live in northern BC, in a rural area, especially for seniors, when you get to an age where you can no longer drive, where you don't want to be out there on icy roads, and you live in a remote, isolated community, there are almost zero options now with the loss of Greyhound across Canada, and with our passenger train service, what it is. People are really isolated, and many of them are choosing to move away from those rural communities where they've spent decades to a larger center, simply because they don't have that basic mobility. So not just on the environmental front, but also on the social equity front, and in terms of supporting rural communities, this is all really important. I think it's time now we can take hands from the audience. If anything has sparked a question for anyone, we have some real expertise on our panel. And I'd love to hear from folks on the call as well. I know we have lots of expertise in the room. I see a hand from Jim McAvoy. And if you can introduce yourself and where you're calling in from, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Jim McAvoy, obviously. I'm in Ottawa. I just, hopefully, two quick questions. First, in regards to your bill, which I love. I already wrote my MP to say, go for it. I want to know, how much did the length of freight trains play in affecting traffic, and would legislating a cap on freight train lengths be a viable solution? And then read the high-speed rail proposal. How much of a poison pill for private partners would it be to remove the operation part of it from that proposal?
Okay, length of freight trains, and this is for HFR, removing the operations from HFR?
Yeah,
okay,
that's right.
So I can take a stab at length of freight trains, and then maybe we'll throw it to Terry for the HFR piece. I have heard that one of the challenges is that because companies like CN are pulling longer and longer freight trains, sometimes they can't even get them onto the sidings because of the constraints of the siding length. So now you have a situation where the only option is to push every other train onto the siding to allow those trains through. It's something we heard from the onboard crew here at VIA, and they've told us that that CN is now either being required or voluntarily running shorter trains, which is helping to alleviate that problem in some parts of the country. But I know where we live, the length of trains has become quite extraordinary with these long container trains. And part of the piece around my bill, giving passenger trains priority and allowing them through and getting the freight traffic out of the way, I think the quid pro quo that it comes with is that there's a role for the federal government to build more infrastructure to allow freight trains to get off and accommodate them in areas where we can twin the tracks, where we can create longer and more sidings. That would be a really good investment that would allow us to better accommodate both freight and passenger traffic. Because we know that, this isn't just about allowing the passenger trains through. We also need to have a situation for freight where it's able to get where it needs to go within some reasonable amount of time. And so that means building more infrastructure. And, when it comes to investments like HFR, we're talking about, potentially tens of billions of dollars. I think for a fraction of that amount, you could improve the track capacity across the country in areas where it's relatively straightforward to twin the tracks. But I'm gonna throw it to Terry and see if he can comment on the piece around the operations of HFR and any other thoughts he has there.
So actually, what you said would taking operations out of the HFR procurement be a poison pill. And actually, I'm kind of wondering why putting operations into the HFR procurement isn't a poison pill, because when you actually HFR originally was going to be get a private partner to build it, perhaps finance the new tracks, and then VRL was going to operate it. So the private partner would only be really responsible for the things it can really manage, like industrial risk, design build. That's what the private sector really does quite well. Everywhere in the world, you build public infrastructure by getting a private general contractor to come and build it for you. and you run an open and fair procurement to do that. When you put operations in, you actually constrain the number of people who can potentially bid, the people who've got the economic heft to take on all this extra risk. And then you're extending the risk period up to 30 to 50 years in the future. Now, anybody who can tell me what the population of Peterborough, Ontario is going to be in 2081, please tell me what the lottery numbers are as well. Because that's actually the kind of thing we're asking the private partner to bet on now. You know, what is the population, what is even the basic population of these cities going to be 50 years down the line, which is going to be the ultimate determinant of available market size. You know, how well you advertise, how comfortable your seats are, is incremental to these kind of really big core decisions like, you know, what's our immigration policy going to be? Are we going to fix our housing crisis? The things that are going to determine the total market that's available. Are we going to, you know, what's our policy around other modes of transportation going to be? Are we going to get serious about reducing emissions from air transport, etc.? All of those are government decisions. The private partner will have no control over them, but is asked to try and bank on them. I would not want to be trying to balance that particular spreadsheet myself.
All right, thanks, Terry. And I just wonder if Christopher, do you want to chime in on that? Maybe around the question of the length of freight trains. I don't believe that we have really long freight trains on the corridor that are an issue, but I wonder what your experience has been working on board with the length of freights.
Yeah, it definitely was a really big issue for many years. Just over the last year, and maybe even just the last 6 months, CN especially has adjusted that policy, and they do seem to be running much shorter trains. Many reasons for that, not just you know, delaying passenger trains probably wasn't a major issue. I mean, they were blocking crossings in towns, and they were preventing emergency vehicles from getting across, you know, from one side of the city to the other across the track. So there's a number of issues that have come from these longer train lengths. And yes, we've definitely seen a reduction from that. We could also see a return at any point. And so it is concerning. And so that speaks to the length of trains. Speaking to the taking out the operational aspect from the HFR plan, honestly, we may see the 3 consortium that are in the running say that the operational component is too challenging. And part of me wants to see that result, to be sure. I think it makes a lot of sense to build the HFR line by itself and to invest in VIA at the public level, at the federal level as we've been doing. Now, but a lot remains to be seen with what the proposals are from these consortia.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. I saw a comment in the chat, someone saying if we can try to avoid using acronyms, that would be helpful. And I am aware that this conversation can quickly get pretty technical and pretty esoteric. So for folks who are joining with kind of a high level interest in passenger rail, you know, we don't want to lose folks. So when we're talking about HFR, HFR stands for high frequency rail, and specifically, it is the name of a project that the Liberal government has proposed for the corridor between Toronto and Quebec City. And essentially what they want to do is build a new dedicated passenger rail line that would see, originally the idea was to see conventional trains operate at higher frequencies and slightly higher speeds. And now with some pushback from Toronto City Council, Montreal City Council, they've asked the proponents to also include proposals that include high speed along some segments. So potentially speeds upwards of 200 or 300 kilometers an hour. And as Terry outlined, their proposal is a public-private partnership, which means it's a form of privatization. They want to bring in private companies that are going to deliver private profits, get those companies to finance the project, construct the project, and then operate the trains for the next 50 or more years under contract to the government. So that's kind of in a nutshell, when we talk about HFR, that's what's being referred to. So hopefully we won't have too many other acronyms that are really complicated, but next up on the list, we are going to go to, I think we're going to Nelson next. Just looking, and my staff's helping me here. Nelson is up next. Nelson, you can unmute yourself. Take it away. Nope, did we lose him? Okay, we might have to come back to Nelson. Maybe he lost the connection because I did see his hand up. I know Roger has had his hand up for a while. Roger, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. So I'm in Calgary, and somebody posted a map in the chat of back in the day when there was actually Via Rail coming through Calgary, or train service through Calgary. I was late to the party. I never experienced that. In 2010, I had my first train trip via, I went to a climate conference in Montreal, and the organizers said, if you want to travel by train, then we'll pay your fare. So twist my rubber arm. I got a sleeping berth to and from Montreal with food in the dining car, and I was an evangelist from that point on for Via. I've taken 11 friends and family members on train trips, and I paid their fare because I just love traveling by train. But I always have to get my butt up to Edmonton because there is no train service through Calgary. And I'm glad that you spoke about the idea of putting in new railway siding. Like the number of times that I sat on a piece of siding waiting for a freight train to come from like 30 miles upstream on the track.
Yeah. I
think that could go a long way towards reducing delays, keeping trains on time. I had no idea about this HFR proposal, this project going ahead in Ontario. I'm no fan of privatization, and I'm happy to write my MP about that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Roger. Any comments on any of what Roger said there? Looking to Nate, Terry, Chris. Okay, I think some excellent comments, especially the observation about sitting on a siding in a passenger train and there's no freight train anywhere in sight, and you actually have to wait half an hour or more because that's the only siding available for that stretch
easily,
of track.
like I've waited 2 hours before we saw that train.
Yeah. Nate,
sure.
I see your hand up there. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in a bit about the P3 conversation right before Roger's comments. So in our view, passenger revenues should really be going back into improving service rather than paying off P3 financiers or paying for private profits. I come from the world of urban transit, and what the studies have shown is that it works exactly like, when you expand a highway, you create induced demand and people end up driving more. The exact same thing applies to public transit. If you invest in it, you make it a more convenient and reliable travel option that comes on time and gets you where you need to go, more people will ride it. And that's what we've seen in every other country that does invest in its transit systems and its passenger rail systems. And the countries that have the lowest costs per kilometer of building these rail systems don't use P3s. There's been a recent international study called from the Transit Cost Project that looked at this in different countries all around the world, and they found that the countries that had the lowest cost per kilometer did not use P3s, and that's why we think we should be revisiting this this procurement model, because when transit costs more to build, that means you get less of it. And when you get less of it, that's reduced GHG emissions you could have been avoiding otherwise. So that's something that we think Canada should really be looking into it. And what these other countries are doing that is quite a lot better than what we are doing in Canada, which is just total outsourcing. And cities who have our federal government and Via, to be honest, have forgotten how to build big things, and we need to be building up that capacity inside government to be able to do it again.
Great points, Nate. Thanks for chiming in with that. I see Nelson is back, but first we're going to go to Tracy Ramsey. And if I can just say one quick word about Tracy Ramsey, she was the wonderful MP from Sussex with the NDP for years, and is now the National Women's Director with Unifor. And it's wonderful to see you on the call, Tracy. Thanks for all your work, and love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you so much for having this really important town hall tonight. And I want to thank Chris for all the excellent work he's been doing at Unifor, and our Atlantic Regional Director, Jen Murray, who has also been doing fantastic work on this. And, you know, from our perspective, when we look at what happens when we privatize, the increase in fares, which we've been having a conversation about, deteriorating safety standards, which none of us can have happen on our rails in our country, lower wages. You know, we end up with workers who are being pressed and pushed down upon because these corporations want more money. None of this is a winning solution. And the other problem that exists is when we privatize these corridors, like we're talking about the Quebec-Windsor corridor, this is a moneymaker. This is where the bulk of the funds come to be able to support really small runs in New Brunswick and across the country. And so what happens if we privatize this? We lose the ability to then support all of these other very important critical runs that need to happen, that people need to have access to because they're affordable, that workers need those good jobs in those communities. And so there's so much more at threat, under threat from this privatization scheme that's being proposed. And so I really want to thank you for having this important town hall and addressing it. And from a worker's perspective, you know, we can't afford to have workers being paid less in our country right now, and certainly not having less safety standards on our rails.
Great comments, Tracy. Thanks so much for bringing that up. And the corridor right now is 80% of Via Rail's revenue. So if they privatize, if the government privatizes the corridor and takes 80% of Via Rail's revenue away from the Crown Corporation, it's going to be left with a shadow of its former self in order to operate all those routes that are so important to rural Canada. So that's a big part of the threat. The other thing that I heard in someone's comments at committee was that if HFR can make money for private investors, it can turn a profit for Via Rail. And that profit can be driven back into the public good. It can be reinvested in expanding passenger rail across our country. So that's the kind of vision that we really want to get behind. Next, we're going to go to Nelson. Nelson, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nelson Mahmoudi. It's really great to see everyone coming out to support Via Rail and talking about such an important subject. I am a onboard service attendant with Via Rail based out of Ottawa. I'm also a grievance officer with the Ontario Onboard team. Christopher is our chairperson. So good to see you, brother Christopher. My question for you is, as a British Columbian, as a BC-based MP, do you have any information regarding, because we spoke about the expansion of service, and the Malahat, also known as the Victoria Kootenay route, was cut many years ago. And there's been discussions about possibly bringing it back, whether it's just Victoria to Langford. With these ideas of expanding service, if we can get to that point, do you have any information regarding the expansion of service back onto Van Isle?
Thanks so much, Nelson. So you're talking about the Vancouver Island Rail Corridor, correct? Which I believe goes from Victoria up to Courtenay.
Correct. Yes.
If I'm correct, and had operational passenger service for many years. It hasn't had passenger service for the past number of years. And I think there was a court ruling, if I'm not mistaken, that required the government to indicate its intentions. And I see Terry's hand because he has the actual facts on this. So perhaps we'll hand it over to Terry and he can tell you what the state of play is when it comes to the Vancouver Island Rail Corridor.
Well, I'm going to say straight away that I'm not an absolute expert on the nuances of this, and the situation obviously with the Vancouver Island Rail Corridor is when it was originally built, the colonial government took the land from First Nations, and in some cases it took land from reserves that were already very small, pocket handkerchief sized, without any consultation, without anything. And the railway was a tool of the railway in its early days was a tool of colonization and resource extraction and exploitation. And the First Nations on Vancouver Island have extremely legitimate concerns and extremely legitimate desire for proper restitution and reconciliation to really move forward. And that is absolutely central to this. But what actually happened from a railway point of view is the Island Corridor Foundation, which is actually an organization made up of the regional districts and 14 First Nations, owns the track. And that was created quite a long time ago when CP wanted to get rid of it to take over ownership of the corridor and maintain it. Declining freight volumes meant that there wasn't cash flow for track maintenance, and the federal government declined to step in to keep the track up to standard where VIA could continue to run passenger service. So passenger service was suspended in 2011. The Island Corridor Foundation applied to the federal government for funding in 2017, or around 2017. They applied to the federal government for funding to restore the track. This was being reviewed by Industry Canada, but at the same time, we did have a couple of the First Nations put forward this suit. So if you're not using this land, give it back, which is fair. If you're not going to use it, then give it back. But Industry Canada, the main reason it wasn't being used, it wasn't repaired. But Industry Canada said because it's not being because there's this court case, we won't actually advance the application for repair funding. So you have a complete chicken and egg situation, which then takes 5 years to roll through the court system. Which is really quite unfortunate and doesn't get us really to a point of advancing mobility for all on Vancouver Island, creating green jobs, creating possibly quite high-tech green jobs, because one of the options that would work extremely well on Vancouver Island, because the corridor length and density is possibly hydrogen propulsion. But there is one thing that really needs to be said about Vancouver Island, is that the attitude from Ottawa has been that this is a remote service. Well, yeah, maybe 50 years ago, but now the population of Vancouver Island is nearly 1 million people. Nanaimo to Victoria is equivalent to Dublin to Rosellaire Island or something like that in terms of population density and distance and size of communities. It's actually an intercity corridor, or it could be. And the other great challenge you have on Vancouver Island is it's totally impractical, both just from a geological and engineering point of view, and also because of reconciliation concerns, to go adding loads more highway lanes over the Malahat. So we do need real commitments by the federal government to really listen. And I saw the Indigenous Concerns report that was produced last year, and it was very thin on detail, sadly. And I don't think that it constituted a real exercise in listening, not just to concerns about the railway, but to all the concerns that need to be addressed holistically. So we need a government that comes to the table and says, right, we are going to really step up on reconciliation. We're going to find a way to address the concerns that the First Nations legitimately have about the parts of the corridor that cross their land. We're going to find a way to make a fair deal that all parties voluntarily enter into, for this to continue, that really does address what's going on. Because if you look, for example, at Snow First Nation, both the railway and the highway bisect the territory, and the BC government is currently working on changing the highway interchange a little bit, but up until very recently, you couldn't actually drive from one side of the territory to the other without leaving the territory, taking a big detour and coming back. That's absurd. And there was a small footbridge and that's it. So yes, we do need to actually make sure the First Nations have proper land bases, aren't bisected like this, but we also need a viable transportation corridor that gives people mobility safely, with personal safety, in an environmentally friendly way. And it's going to take a real effort and real listening to First Nations by federal and provincial government in a way maybe they haven't done enough before to bring this to fruition now.
Well said, Terry. Yeah, some really important points there. And of course, you can't talk about the railroad in Canada without talking about the way that it was built and the disregard that the people behind it showed for Indigenous people right across the country. And in Northwest BC, where I represent, I hear from so many elders about the damage that was done when the railroad came through. And there are many instances that still haven't been reconciled or dealt with properly. And I note just the other day in the news that the Indigenous Relations Committee, or the Indigenous Consultation Committee for CN, which is made up of Indigenous leaders, all resigned en masse because, and it wasn't clear what the specific issues were, but because their issues weren't being addressed adequately by the corporation. So I think there's really, like you're saying, there's a role for government to, to do the right thing and to listen carefully and ensure that those concerns are being heard and acted on. And the Vancouver Island Rail Corridor is a perfect example of that, because the potential for passenger rail is so great, but we can only realize it if the government does right by the Indigenous nations along that route. We're going to go next to Chris Alamany. Chris, good to see you.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Taylor. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Awesome. Great. You know what? I'm in Port Alberni on Vancouver Island. So I want to say Terry did a really amazing job of explaining the Island Corridor Foundation and the whole situation there. And that was part of my question. So I really appreciate that. I have three little questions, one bigger than the other, but one thing I've had a really hard time finding is actual public information about CO2 emissions from via rail. I don't know if they're publicly required to publish that kind of information. Even something simple like, how much fuel do they consume on a trip? Something concrete that we can use as the public to be able to really make the point that these are environmentally friendly modes of transportation. The other one my other question is really around that intercity issue, right? The railway did provide a service to Canadians across the country, really connecting small and large cities, in conjunction with our bus services, which was Greyhound for the most part for many, many years, and that has essentially evaporated. And what do you see as far as this initiative, whether it's the bill to prioritize rail transportation or something else? How can we sort of get that ball rolling as far as really energizing the conversation around that intercity component that we've really lost in Canada? And then my last question was really that First Nations piece. How do we, in a proper and a reconciliation focused way, include and have First Nations lead these kinds of conversations? And so those are my questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Maybe I'll tackle the one around inter-community transit, and then I wonder if Nate might weigh in on the emissions from via rail and what we know about that picture. When it comes to inter-community transportation, and Chris, you and I have worked together on bus advocacy. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on Transport held hearings on bus transport in Canada in the wake of Greyhound pulling its service out of our country. And we've worked in the Northwest for years. Of course, folks are aware of the Highway of Tears and the tragic history in our region, and the need to advocate for safe transport. I was really struck in all of those years of advocating and listening to communities, when we talked about buses, how many people tried to change the subject to talk about trains. People are really, they see the rail line running right through communities. Many people who are old enough to remember when passenger rail was a really viable solution for getting between communities, even short distances. And they want to see that again. And many people have traveled to other countries and seen how other countries operate passenger rail in a really effective and affordable way. So that was kind of partly what inspired me to start working on these passenger rail issues, because I think there's such resonance for Canadians. There's a real interest in having a viable passenger rail system. And it could, for many communities, it could fill that gap that's left by Greyhound pulling out, where we have rail lines. Certainly, along Highway 16 and where rail corridors exist, that's an option. Bus service is going to be important in many other places. We're not going to build rail lines to every little community. For remote First Nations communities, of course, bus service is going to be a much more viable option. But wherever we can, I think expanding via rail and expanding passenger rail service is going to be really great for intercommunity transport, and could alleviate some of those issues that we talk about when it comes to people's safety, when it comes to affordability, when it comes to accessibility for seniors, for people with disabilities. This is a solution that could really work. So Nate, do you want to weigh in on emissions from via rail and what we know?
Yeah, well, I just the numbers I have in front of me, but if a trip taken by on electric rail transit, you're looking at 0.01 kilograms of CO2 versus a gas car of 2.3 kilograms of CO2. And that's just urban travel. Those are the numbers I have in front of me. I'm sure that I do remember seeing in Amtrak's service expansion pitch, I'll have to go dig it up. The actual comparisons between a diesel train and an electric train and all those differences. And I think that highlights my point I made earlier. We really need via rail to be advocating for itself, like Amtrak does, with giving its own legislative mandate, having it put out more of this kind of information, so more Canadians know how environmentally friendly rail transit is, to convince more Canadians to take it.
Absolutely. One thing I'll note is that I know with the HFR proposal, the idea, at least in the first iteration of HFR, when Via Rail was the proponent, the idea was to electrify as much of the service as possible. And so the electrification of rail it holds huge potential for driving down emissions. But even short of that, if we're operating conventional trains and pulling full cars full of passengers, it's an incredibly efficient way to use fossil fuels, and it results in far less emissions per capita than single vehicles. Terry, I see your hand up. Do you want to chime in on that? And then we'll go. We've got 3 more folks in the queue.
Thanks, Taylor. Because I'm also seeing a whole bunch of chat about the emissions question for Via Rail. I did put in the chat a link to Via State sustainability reports as well. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind when you're looking at the carbon emissions of the Canadian per passenger on long distance passenger rail. Yeah, actually, the Canadians' carbon emissions per passenger are relatively high compared to passenger rail in the rest of the world. Why? A few reasons. One of them is, of course, the train now takes 4.5 days instead of 3.5 days to complete the journey. If the train was completing the journey in 3.5 days, emissions would be a lot lower. And that's purely down to rescheduling to accommodate a lot more slack in the timetable to make up for freight delays, et cetera, et cetera. That is the kind of thing that Taylor's bill would actually redress and say, right, we're actually going to run the train faster, and we're going to run it on time, because when you run the train on time, it becomes much more practical to use it for trips between Winnipeg and Saskatoon, or even Portage and Wainwright, or wherever you need to go. And if that train is coming at least within a 2-hour window, you might actually use it. Whereas if it's could be 6 to 12 hours late, you're very unlikely to use it for a short coach intercity journey if you have any alternative. A lot of people don't still use it. So then you put a lot more passengers on the train as well. So you actually running the trains on time itself reduces the emissions. The other thing that would significantly reduce the emissions would be getting a new fleet of trains. Even if they're still conventionally powered for the time being, the new fleet in the corridor, significant reduction in CO2 emissions, massive reductions in other kinds of emissions. Just because you're taking equipment that's decades old and replacing it with the most modern available technology. Now, Via Rail does advocate for itself with Transport Canada, but sometimes isn't allowed to publicly say what it's advocating. But we do know that Via Rail is very interested, from the HFR project, in zero emission modes of propulsion. Now, we don't currently have the technology to scale hydrogen to the distance, to the kind of distances that we're running our long distance services. We don't. We might have for regional services, but certainly as we renew the fleet, we should be looking, and I believe we are looking at locomotives that will be convertible to alternative modes of propulsion in future, as indeed the new corridor trains are. Everybody's saying, well, why are these new corridor trains diesel that we're just buying right now? Well, because at the moment we don't have overhead wires, but you can put a pantograph on those locomotives relatively easily as a retrofit. Remember that nearly every train is actually a diesel generator making electricity to power its traction motors. So you already have an electric train to run under the wires if you have wires. To the most part, Via Rail is, as a guest on host railways, dependent on the host railways themselves electrifying. And both CN and CP are both looking at decarbonizing as well. They're under a lot of pressure to decarbonize. They're looking at hydrogen, they're looking at batteries. For some reason, they're not actually looking at catenary very hard yet. And I would actually question why, because if you've got 200 cars of potash and you're at the top of the Rogers Pass, the amount of energy that is going to release on the way down that you could feed back through that catenary and basically sell for money rather than wasting, is not insignificant.
Barry, what's the word there you're using for the overhead wires? I'm not familiar with that one.
So catenary.
Catenary. Okay.
But
those are overhead train wires.
Because of the curved shape of it and everything else. Sorry, I used, with apologies to our guests, I guess I used a technical term again. But
no, it's all good.
Wires. Yeah.
So you're basically saying that trains going downhill could generate electricity and put it back into the grid through these overhead wires.
That's how this works in Europe. Is you're breaking energy that goes back into the wires. Your energy going downhill goes back into the wires to either power other trains or even be sold back into the grid.
Nice, nice.
And actually, in Holland, for example, if the commuter train is approaching a station, its braking energy is going into battery packs at the station, which charge electric buses for people making connections through that station.
Amazing.
There's an amazing amount you can do with electricity once you start using it for rail.
We've got some work to do. Roger wanted to weigh in really quickly on the emissions question, and then we're going to go to Peter.
Yeah, on one of my trips that I did to Toronto, there was a just retired university professor in mathematics who was riding from Vancouver back to his house in Toronto. And he talked to the train manager who gave him the number of passengers. I think it was more than half full, but I don't think it was 3/4 full. Anyway, at the end of the trip, he was eventually able to tease out of Via the amount of diesel fuel they used from Vancouver to Toronto. So he emailed me later, and he said that what he worked out to was per passenger, it was roughly equivalent to the mileage that you would get if you were a single person driving in a hybrid, like in a Prius hybrid. So more people on the train would be more efficient than that.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah, interesting. I thought it would be far more than that with a half full train. Go for it, Nate.
I just posted in the chat there a link. If you scroll down to page 18, there's a great little graphic that compares all the different modes and the GHG emissions for each trip.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. So folks can check that in the chat. Nate has just posted that link. Let's go to Peter next. Peter.
Yes, hi, I'm from Toronto. So there's been a lot of discussion, both verbally and on the chat, on improving proper rail service, building longer sidings, double tracking, electrifying. We've got to remember that these are 95% privately owned corridors, CN and CP. And so we're really talking, I guess, about putting public money into a private corridor that they will continue to own and operate, presumably. Now, can this be done is my question. I mean, Via tried this back about 10 or 15 years ago on the Kingston sub, which runs between Toronto along Lake Ontario towards Kingston. They invested a lot of money. The project went to add more sidings and double tracking. The The project went way over budget. They got way less new train paths than they hoped. The Auditor General took a look at it and basically dumped over via on that project. Now, Metrolink seems to be doing a better job. They have a very large checkbook and pay CN for construction. But of course, they're also working shorter distances, so that helps. So my question to the panel really is can we indeed improve these rail corridors, which are privately operated, and do it right? Can we learn from previous mistakes and do it right?
Who wants to take that one on? Terry, you want to take a shot at that?
Of course, yeah, I'll take a shot at that. So one of the things that we've got to remember is we're all stakeholders in this, both for freight and passengers. We travel, but we also buy, farm, mine, manufacture, retail, market, finance, all of this stuff that's on the freight trains as well. So what we really should be looking for the most part, is what is the biggest win-win when we come to the table and say let's improve the situation, and what's fair. So CN, I'll give them credit, have actually been investing quite a lot of money in additional sidings, in additional double tracking across the prairies as their demand has increased, and that's also resulted in an improvement in passenger performance. We had a situation in 2012 when between 2009 and 2012, VIA received some funding from the federal government to invest in additional tracks on the Kingston corridor between Toronto and Montreal. Now, when you invest on CN's tracks, CN are basically the general contractor, they're in charge of it. And what happened is we didn't get as much third track as we thought we were going to get. And when we did get it, VIA didn't get as many paths on that track as it thought it was going to get. So we've got to make sure that it's fair to all concerned. It's kind of the rotary four-way test has got to apply to rail funding. But there are huge opportunities to look at the rail network and say, what are the tremendous bottlenecks? One of the worst of the lot in Western Canada is the new Westminster Rail Bridge between Surrey and downtown Vancouver. And it's federally owned structure. It's 104 years old. And it's used by CN, it's used by CP, it's used by BNSF, it's used by Southern Railway British Columbia and VIA and Amtrak. And it's got a 10-mile-an-hour speed restriction on it. And we need to renew that bridge. And the Canada Infrastructure Bank actually did start doing some work on that in 2021, but the file's gone quiet. I'm a little bit worried about that because you do not want to be in a situation where that bottleneck becomes a complete logjam. And if you look for those kind of situations where the federal government can invest, not small dollars, it was quite big dollars to renew a bridge, but where it will have a ripple effect outwards through the network. Because if you're trying to run freight trains to make meets at sidings, and you have a logjam in Vancouver, that has effects all the way to Winnipeg. The same way as in southwestern Ontario, where I live. We have sections of single track between London and Sarnia that were previously double track years ago. If you put that second track back, that would actually have ripple effects in terms of network fluidity for freight and passengers, at least all the way to Toronto. And in that case, it's actually quite cheap. In New Brunswick, the track between Campbellton and Moncton is in many places only 30 miles an hour track. And it doesn't carry a lot of freight. So if we want the passenger train to run efficiently and on time, we're going to have to step up with the money for that, because most of the benefit would indeed go to the passengers. So it's a question of where are our win-wins? It's a really important question, is how do we invest effectively? How do we respect the freight railroads as partners while recognizing their social responsibility to the communities they run through as well?
Okay, thanks for that, Terry. Now, Harry had his hand up for quite a while and then he put it down. Harry, I wonder if you still have a question or a comment you want to add. If so, we'll let you hop in now.
Okay, surely. Quite a while ago, Roger talked about passenger service being totally absent from Calgary. There is currently a proposal by a private company in Banff to run a train from Banff to Calgary and Calgary to Banff, partly to serve their ski resort called Northway. There's also another project which has some wings to provide a high-speed train between Calgary and Edmonton. The financial montage for the one or the other is not complete, but it does show that there is interest in Alberta in reviving service over the former CP line from Banff to Calgary and on the one or the other rights of way between Edmonton and Calgary, whether a new right of way or the Canadian Pacific one is not really clear yet. My point is this, the passenger generation of the Bow Valley, and in particular Banff and Calgary, is so impressive that in the days when the Canadian Pacific train was the Canadian, and even in the early years of Via's Canadian, that tourist draw helped propel that service into profit every summer. Of course, it lost money in the winter, but overall, everybody was pretty satisfied with the Canadian as it was then between Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto, Montreal. It was Brian Mulroney and his crew that got the brilliant idea of sacking that service, which was probably the most successful transcontinental service in North America at the time, with a vague idea of privatizing it, which never happened. There has been discussion since of reviving it. In one case, a federal transport minister that I know personally proposed to CP that they discuss it. So CP said, we'll come back to you with the figures for the cost of adapting the track as it is now. They came back with a bill for $200 million. So the minister said, oh, I guess I won't have that kind of money in my budget. But the point is that in general, that railway is better run for passengers in its other manifestations, mostly in the United States, than the Canadian national services. To illustrate, Amtrak rates Canadian Pacific as the #1 passenger train operator for their trains. And for a long time, CN was 10th on the list, way down. They've moved up in the league a bit because of dropping the insistence on long trains. But I think there's terrific potential on the whole or parts of the Canadian Pacific Transcon line to run a regular passenger service. So that's my comment. Based on
really interesting stuff, Harry. Thanks so much for adding that historical context. And if I'm not mistaken, you've got a caboose in the background of your shot there. So you're obviously a train buff.
Oh, indeed. I was a Canadian Pacific employee for several years before I went into criminology.
Oh, fantastic.
Between the two, but I won't say what.
Well, thanks for adding your thoughts. And I will add that when it comes to passenger service in Alberta, both between Calgary and Edmonton and along the, I believe it's the Calgary-Banff corridor, that is going to be within the scope of our parliamentary study that's currently ongoing, studying high frequency rail. So there are going to be some meetings dedicated to the Alberta situation. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to share the link with you and you could follow along.
To see that. Thank you, Taylor.
You betcha. Thanks for joining us. We're going to go next to Durka, and then after Durka, we're going to go to Adam and then Pierce. Durka.
Hi, I didn't expect to be speaking so soon because there were others with their hands up before me. But thank you again, Taylor, for putting on this very important initiative and putting forward that private members bill. I have a couple of comments and then a question. So the first one is the European Union treats state-owned enterprises like Via Rail very seriously, and they actually produce documents on how they should be governed and how to make them more sustainable. And it's a sad thing that we don't do something similar here in Canada. Secondly, I forgot what my second point is, so I'll just jump into a question because I was in the point of making some notes. First of all, apart from Indigenous issues with respect to a track that is not actively used, we see a lot of communities inheriting tracks from either CNOCP or rail lines that don't exist anymore. What is the potential for the federal government to acquire those tracks, seeing with the intent to service, I would say, rural and underserviced communities? Secondly, it strikes me that this is something that Transport Canada would be interested in. However, just as a casual observer, I've noticed that Transport Canada is sort of not really a very active participant in public transportation at all, except maybe, we hear about them for freight and for airlines, but not for interprovincial travel. So is there any way that Transport Canada's mandate could be strengthened?
Great questions. Thanks so much, Durka. And the first one was around what is the potential for the federal government to acquire unused rail corridors or rail tracks and use them for the expansion of passenger rail. And the second one was around Transport Canada not being a really active participant in passenger transportation. And so maybe starting with the second one, I think that's a very apt observation. That's certainly been my observation as MP, that Transport Canada's focus as a regulator and as a federal department, certainly when it comes to buses and passenger rail, has been pretty, I would say, pretty passive. And I'm not sure if that has to do with the federal minister's view that passenger transportation is largely provincial jurisdiction. Certainly, this is something that we bumped into with the conversation about buses. Hearing again and again from the former transport minister that bus transportation was not in his wheelhouse, and that if the provinces wanted to do stuff on buses, he was happy to play some sort of a coordinating role or put some dollars on the table, but he wasn't going to lead with a big vision on bus transportation. And I think by the same token, we've seen limited leadership when it comes to passenger rail, especially the role of Via Rail. Certainly HFR has captured the attention of the Liberal government because in its current iteration, it fits with their view of what the Canada Infrastructure Bank should be doing, which is going out there and finding private investors to build public infrastructure and deliver private profits. But apart from that, I think we've seen a really hands-off approach, and perhaps Terry or Nate or Chris could comment on that. The other one was around inheriting tracks, and we see a lot of these old rail beds turned into trails for biking and walking, and I think that's lovely, and many communities want that, and it's certainly they're wonderful amenities in so many communities. But at the same time, we are also losing these rail corridors as potential passenger rail services. So the question is whether the federal government could acquire them, and I can't see any barrier other than political will. If the federal government had a mandate to expand passenger rail, then they would probably be looking more carefully at these opportunities. And of course, those historic rail beds would have to connect viable population bases and make sense from a transportation planning perspective. Some of them go back hundreds of years or 100 years anyway to a different time when population was located in different spots. But I'm just wondering, Nate or Terry, do you guys want to weigh in on this?
I can weigh in at least a little bit.
Okay.
So I want to give you an example. The Scarborough subway extension is $3 billion project. And had it not been for the fact that a piece of former rail bed was sold off to allow people to extend their backyards at about $50 a time, that project could have actually used that alignment and saved the taxpayer billions of dollars and delivered the Scarborough subway extension much sooner than it's going to be delivered. So not having the foresight to rail bank linear infrastructure corridors, especially in our urban areas, is a way to completely rip off the taxpayer, to be quite honest. If you let something like that go, you are ripping off future taxpayers. And that's also the case, almost any linear infrastructure corridor. These things existed for a reason. We honestly, as a country, overbuilt our infrastructure at the beginning of the last century, thinking that people thought that Canada would become 100 million people in short order. Well, maybe now we're getting there. Maybe now we're going to need these infrastructure corridors, or at least in the foreseeable, foreseeable if you're a long-termist and think 30 to 50 years in the future. So, for example, another example that really Transport Action has worked on, we find it really grating, is the Orangeville-Brampton Railway. Orangeville is close enough to Toronto that it's going to grow quite a lot. And that railway line was ripped up. It'll be converted to a trail, and getting it converted back to rail after that's going to actually be really expensive and time consuming. Same with Barrie to Collingwood. Right? How many people go to Collingwood on a weekend or to ski or in the winter, but letting the railway go and making them all drive? Why are we doing this? So I think we need to really, as a country, use the right we actually have in law. The federal government has first option on any corridor being abandoned, as do the provinces, to put these in our piggy bank for future use. Save the taxpayer a fortune.
Yeah, it's all about thinking into the future, right? And not foreclosing on opportunities that could make sense down the road. Thanks, Terry. We're going to go next to Adam, who's been waiting. Adam.
Hi, I'm a student at Concordia University in Montreal, and I'm from Burlington, Ontario, which is where I'm speaking to you from now. So I'm somebody that's fortunate enough to live in an area that is decently well connected to a major city by rail, and actually multiple major cities. My grandmother says that me having a girlfriend in Toronto and going to school in Montreal, that if I could, I should be buying shares in Via Rail. I hope that that's not something that is ever possible in the future. But looking at, and this is something Dirk had touched on, looking at the governance of Via Rail, one issue we've seen even just here tonight in regards to their discussion on emissions is that it's hard to see what Via is actually doing, what's the state they're in, emissions-wise, financials. We get some insight in, we get little to no insight on operations. We don't know the reasons for the decisions that they're making, even including small little passenger-facing items like why do we line up to get on a train like we're at an airport, things like that. And even though they're a public entity, they're not very accountable, and it's not something that many people know. Christopher mentioned this briefly, but Via is not you're not a typical Crown corporation. It's not. It's not something that is accountable to Parliament and in a greater sense the public. It was created through somewhat of a back door, and it operates at the discretion of the minister. And this is something that can and should be fixed, as you have said, through legislation. And as Chris has said, legislation that should be putting the riding public and workers at the table. And it would go a lot of ways to fix many issues that Via faces in expanding passenger rail, because it's hard to long-term plan when you're subject to a little kind of under the table subsidy every budget cycle, and you also get the effect that and Terry could probably expand on this a little bit more, but private and public sector partners not wanting to sign agreements with you if you don't have long-term stability guaranteed back through enabling legislation. So that's a huge barrier to passenger rail expansion in Canada, and I think something that could be immediately worked on in the near term. And I hope to see you going forward with that. And I'd also be happy to pass you my number if you want some more rants. But
that would be fantastic, Adam. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. I know it's not much of a question, but I think it's a good thing for all of us to recognize. It's something that the first time I learned about that, I was like, what? That's absurd. It's been operating this way since the 70s. Like,
yeah, it's a really interesting structure for Via Rail, and I appreciate you putting your finger on what the difference is, and the fact that Via Rail operates at the discretion of the minister, and essentially and the whims of the minister. If the minister wanted to defund Via Rail or take it in a different direction, there aren't the checks and balances that other crown corporations would be subject to. And just on that point, there have been a number of private members' bills that have been brought forward in Parliament that are more comprehensive than the bill that I brought forward, which is specifically on the issue of passenger priority. But two bills in particular, one by NDP MP Phil Toon in 2016 brought forward the bill that is a comprehensive governance framework for Via Rail. And you can look it up on openparliament.ca. The number is C614. And you can read the text of the bill, and he covers off a huge number of issues, including the governance of the corporation and the mandate and all of these things. Elizabeth May as well from the Green Party has tabled a private members bill giving Via Rail a mandate very much in the same vein. So there has been a lot of work done on this question around governance and accountability and transparency, and trying to put Via Rail on a solid footing so that it can sustain itself over time and have that predictability and that I think people expect from it. I'm just noting the time. I saw someone ask if I'm moving, but it's actually a train next to me that was moving. A train just pulled into the station right next to us. We're at looks like 9:30 Central Time, 8:30 Central Time. So we've been going an hour and a half. Pierce still has his hand up, so let's go to Pierce next. And then maybe after Pierce, we'll do a little wrap up, and people can get back to their evening. So Pierce, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Hi, I'm from McBride, BC, but currently living on the South Coast. So I was wondering about how VIA can specifically improve intra-provincial transportation, because right now we have several routes that go between provinces and they're very long distances, but there's so many old routes. If you look at any map of Via Rail's former routes, there was trains to Prince George from Vancouver, there were trains Edmonton to Calgary, Saskatoon to Regina, all these places that have since lost their rail routes, and all we're left with is like the bare bones of what once existed. So how do we do that? Do we go to provinces to create like BC Rail again, or Alberta Rail, whatever? And another thing I was wondering about is, how do we participate with cities and provinces to specifically improve last mile transportation for a lot of these communities that used to have non-car transportation, but like their downtowns have been ripped up by roads and you can't get anywhere in these places. So how do we, like, it's great if you have a train to your town, but if you can't get anywhere because it's just a sea of parking, what do you do? I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Great questions. Let's go to the second question first, and I'm going to ask Nate if he has thoughts about last mile, because I know he's worked a lot on urban transit, and then we'll go to Terry perhaps for your first question.
Well, the solution really, especially if we're talking about outside of major cities, is have the federal government get involved in operations funding for urban transit. Right now, they're only doing capital funding. So a city is allowed to use money coming from the federal government to buy a new bus, to build a LRT if they want, but usually a major city. But they don't have any, they're not allowed to use any of that money to hire a driver and put that bus into service. So and all the studies show that, putting out more service and expanding service hours, running service more frequently, is the #1 driver of people actually using the service. So how does that make any sense? That we have $23.5 billion that's gone out already. There's been 14.9 announced since in money that's not allowed to be used to run more transit service in urban areas, and especially outside of major cities where urban transit systems are mainly bus-based. The cost for running that service is mainly in driver wages. It's a lot more labor intensive than a rail system. And those kinds of communities are actually hurt the most by that capital bias. So getting the federal government to really get involved in operations, and provinces too. Provinces also have a role to play, especially giving cities new revenue tools that they can use towards putting money into transit operations. But that's the real key, is that you can get real frequent bus service to and from your home and a train station, so we can get to your door, to a different city, and then to your friend's place in a different city, all without ever having to pay for a cab or get in a car. That's the ideal.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nate. Great answer. I wonder if Christopher, do you want to weigh in on the first question? This was about intra-provincial, so passenger routes within provinces and how we work to expand those.
I think there's a lot of opportunities there for sure. We've seen in the States that there have been a number of successful models where basically the state has funded a service and Amtrak has become the operating partner. I think that's a possibility to do that here. It's obviously a very different political landscape, but it could be done. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for something like that. There's a lot of places that need more transit. People rely on the train even today. We talked today a lot about how much people love the train, and if they don't have the train anymore, how much they used to love it and how nostalgic they are for it, right? And there's a service there that needs to be provided. The tracks are there, or in some cases the road beds are there. It's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. There's a low-hanging fruit kind of opportunity that could be taken if we had the political will across, between the provinces and with the federal government to do so.
Awesome. Well said, Chris. And it's funny because as you were saying that, Adam was typing almost the same thing about the state-funded programs into the chat. So you were very much on the same wavelength there. Folks, we're at an hour and a half. I want to thank everyone who's been part of this conversation. This has been a really detailed and in-depth conversation on a whole host of different tentacles of the passenger rail topic, and I hope you found it useful. If you're interested in connecting with Unifor's Get Canada Back on Track campaign, Chris has posted the link in the chat. If you're interested in getting involved with Transport Action Canada, which is one of the leading advocates for passenger transportation in our country, if not the leading advocate, Terry is easy to find online, and you can check out their website, as is Nate at Environmental Defense. And Nate is working on all sorts of different sustainable transportation topics, including zero emission vehicles and the mandate that I believe is coming out tomorrow, but has also been a real leader on transit, urban transit, and intercommunity transit. So I see he's just posted his Twitter handle in the chat, and feel free to reach out to any of our special guests. The question is, what can folks on this call do? And I wanted to leave with just a couple of action ideas. You can write to the Minister of Transport and let Pablo Rodriguez know that passenger rail matters to you, that you want him to show leadership and express some of the specific concerns around Via Rail and the future of our Crown Corporation that delivers public passenger rail. You can also write to your member of parliament, tell them that you saw this private members bill from some guy from BC and that you think it's an all right idea and that you would love it if your MP supported it in some way. Other members of parliament can jointly second private members bills, so they can go onto a special website just for MPs and add their name as a seconder of the bill. That's an easy thing that people can do. We're also going to reach out to you and share other opportunities. We're going to be working on passenger rail for a while yet. I think this is a really exciting file to be working on. And so we've got your email. We're going to send you a note. Feel free to send us a reply and tell us not to email you ever again. But until you do that, we're going to keep sharing ideas with you and opportunities to get involved in this really important work. I want to thank Margaret and Ben for their work pulling together the logistics of this town hall meeting. I want to thank our special guests we've thanked. And I want to thank the Via Rail staff, the folks on board the Canadian who've been taking care of me for the past day and a half. They do an incredible job. These folks love their work. The Canadian is such a special part of our country's history and our country's identity. It connects all of these provinces from east to west. And the people who work on board really, you can tell that they really feel they're a part of that story. And so a big thanks to the uniform members that work so hard on our behalf, and hopefully are going to get me all the way to Smithers in time for Christmas. This is the goal, and we've got a few miles to make before then. I imagine we're going to be pulling out of Winnipeg here pretty shortly, but I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your evening and being with us, and we're going to keep this conversation rolling. So on behalf of my team, happy holidays to everyone, and feel free to send me an email, keep in touch through social media, and hopefully together we can ensure that Canada gets back on track, catches up to the rest of the world, and has a decent passenger train system at long last. Okay, folks, have a wonderful evening.